Thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. This is an amazing turnout. My name's Eric Gallipo, as Carrie said, and some of you may know me as a longtime resident of Asbury Park and perhaps as a member of the Asbury Park Planning Board if you are an addicted watcher of APTV. This evening, however, I'm here before you in my capacity as a professional planner and urban designer, working on behalf of the city and the Asbury Park Arts Council, who have undertaken the creation of the Asbury Park Arts and Culture Plan on behalf of the city. Now, before we launch into the presentation, I want to make sure to thank the library staff and the library itself for hosting us this evening. The service and space you provide to our community is invaluable and essential, and we thank you for all that you do. So, I'd like to briefly review our agenda this evening. I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction about what the plan is and how it came about, talk a little bit about the community context, the goals and strategies that were developed and the recommendations, and then talk about what happens next. As we proceed with the presentation tonight, I'll stop at multiple points to allow for questions and brief discussion. We'll do our best to cover everything. So I'm going to launch in, but you'll see where those opportunities for questions and comments are. Introduction. The Arts and Culture Plan is an endeavor undertaken by the City of Asbury Park in conjunction with the Asbury Park Arts Council, Monmouth Arts, the Monmouth County Department of Planning, and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. My role has been to provide professional arts and culture planning services through my firm, FCA. We're a multidisciplinary planning and design firm with offices in Philadelphia, New York, and Orlando. Over the years, we've done arts and culture plans for municipalities and institutions, including St. Louis Garment District, the Salt Lake City Arts and Culture Plan, the Ocala Arts and Public Places Plan, the New York Botanical Gardens Master Plan, the Military Park Partnership, and we're currently working on the Hoboken, New Jersey's first public art master plan. All funding for this project was provided through a Monmouth County COVID-19 Community Recovery Grant that's being administered by the Asbury Park Arts Council. So when somebody asks you how much did this plan cost the city of Asbury Park, you can respond confidently, $0. So that's good news. I just wanted to make sure to cover that. The first question that I'm going to address this evening is why an arts and culture plan? And so to be specific about Asbury Park, the 2017 City Master Plan defined a 10-year vision for the city as a place with a thriving arts community, a year-round economy, modern infrastructure, expanded community facilities, and an outstanding quality of life for its residents. There was also a specific recommendation in the master plan that the city would complete an arts and culture plan that would inventory arts and cultural assets, identify areas most suitable for arts and culture, and identify the uses, programs, and actions necessary to support a healthy cultural ecosystem. Beyond policy reasoning, arts and culture plans can be powerful tools for cities and communities to foster community cohesion and civic pride, identify gaps and opportunities in the city's cultural landscape, leverage arts and culture as generators of economic development and employment growth, and enhance the quality of life of residents through inclusive, community-based arts and recreational activities. Over the past 8 months, the planning team has been guided by a steering committee comprised of representatives from the Asbury Park City Council, Planning Board and Zoning Board, the Asbury Park Department of Planning and Redevelopment, the Asbury Park Arts Council, the Monmouth County Department of Planning, and the New Jersey State Council on the Arts. This steering committee received regular updates about the research, data gathering, and community engagement activities of the planning team. They've also been directly involved in guiding and providing feedback on goals, strategies, and recommendations that are the outcome of this planning effort. In addition to working with the steering committee, the community and the public have been consistently involved in the creation of this plan. Over the past 8 months, we have spent significant effort learning about the individual attitudes about arts and culture, as well as community perceptions about what more is needed. In the pursuit of that, we have received 153 responses and counting to an online survey, conducted more than 20 interviews with representatives of city government, nonprofit, the school system, and others working in arts and culture throughout the city. We've conducted 5 focus groups that included more than 50 local creators and producers of cultural and community activity. We hosted an open house at Blackbird Commons in December with more than 80 community participants that provided feedback on the specific strategies and recommendations of the plan. And over the past year, we attended many community events and gatherings where conversations with community members rounded out our understanding of the cultural landscape and community needs. The cards you see around this screen were gathered from community members and give you a flavor of how important arts and culture is to individuals and the community at large. Overall, we can identify more than 550 individual touch points that have augmented the inventory and research components of this planning effort. Tonight's presentation will focus primarily on the recommendations of the plan, but I'll also present a summary of some of the data and findings that were important in determining the strategies and recommendations. If you have specific questions, we encourage you to ask them, and we'll do our best to address them this evening. Our planning effort began with an extensive research and inventory to understand the state of the existing art and cultural ecosystem of the city. As part of that effort, we first investigated population demographics from the decennial census. Using this data, we learned that there has been a steady decline in the year-round population of the city over the past 30 years. This definitely runs counter to a common perception of Asbury Park as a city booming with population growth. However, when taken in context to increasing median incomes and ages, coupled with only modest growth in housing over the past 10 years, these trends are consistent with a gentrifying city that may be gaining more part-time residents and the displacement of long-term, full-time residents of the city. This concept will be important as we discuss prioritizing quality of life, cultural activity, and community-based programs that serve the year-round population. We also undertook an extensive inventory of the cultural assets that exist throughout the city. This mapping and research showed a significant level of art and cultural activity across all sectors and parts of the city. In this study, we were able to identify over 180 individual creators, organizations, and organizations related to arts and culture, 80 venues, places, and facilities where arts and culture are produced, and over 60 recurring programs and events that provide a strong sense of Asbury Park as a significant contributor to regional arts and culture. It's important to note that we do not believe we have captured every person, organization, place, or event happening in the city. This inventory is a starting point that should be maintained, augmented, and improved as the arts and culture plan is implemented by the city and its partners. Both the inventory and community engagement activities of this effort revealed some important findings about the state of the city's community facilities and programs. When considering non-commercial activity and its relationship to the residential community, we paid special attention to the resources available through community facilities. What we found is that while there are significant facilities and spatial resources in private venues, community organizations, and schools, both public and private, there are precious few indoor facilities that are perceived as easily accessible or welcoming to the public. The few community facilities, like the one you are in, that do exist are working diligently to provide space and services, but the study has found more services and facilities are needed to fully engage the year-round community in creative pursuits and collective assembly. We also investigated the state of events and venues. Asbury Park is well known for many events and private venues that produce a significant number of arts and cultural offerings. We charted the frequency of all recurring programs and plotted them to understand how cultural activity is distributed throughout the year. What we discovered is that the seasonal nature of the city has a significant impact on the level of cultural activity, with most events occurring in the warmer months of the year. Furthermore, we examined how the prevalence of free and public events compared with that of paid and private events. This analysis showed that while paid and private events generally continue throughout the year, almost all free and public programming for the community is limited to the tourist season. This is another indicator of the lack of high-quality, low-cost indoor facilities for hosting community programs in the off-season. On the right side of the slide, we also analyzed the profile of formal performing arts venues with seasonal outdoor venues on the left and year-round indoor venues on the right. The vertical axis defines those venues that are active on the top and those venues that are inactive on the bottom. The take-home message here is that while we have a significant number of formal venues for hosting cultural events, over 70% of the existing indoor venue capacity is completely unused and inactive. It cannot be understated the detrimental impact this has on the local economic and employment picture when it comes to arts and culture in the city. Related to this is also the concept that there is a crucial distinction between commercial cultural activity that is being produced for private consumption by visitors that is critical to our economic development, and opportunities for free cultural consumption and participation being produced for residents that is crucial to year-round quality of life and community cohesion. Our study examined the different brands and markets that are recognizable contributors to the commercial component of arts and culture and the economy of the city. Based on findings from our survey, research, and engagement activities, it's clear Asbury Park has an established identity as a destination for the beach, food, and live music. While these may be Asbury Park's current strong suit, there are other components of the city's brand as a cultural destination that should be leveraged, encouraged, and supported. Outdoor recreation beyond the beach, historical tourism, learning and making, dance, theater, and other performing arts all have significant potential for increasing Asbury Park's share of the regional creative economy and for engaging our own residents in creative pursuits on the home front. As we make decisions, however, it's important to examine the competitive marketplace to determine what investments will have the greatest impact on the health of our cultural ecosystem. For example, despite the heroic work of various performing arts and theater organizations, the city does not currently have a functioning fixed-seat venue capable of hosting a full-scale theatrical production. While redevelopment of existing inactive venues such as Convention Hall or the Savoy Theater in the Kenmouth Building downtown may fill some of those gaps, they would be entering an extremely competitive performing arts landscape both within the county and the region. This map shows just some of the functioning formal performing arts venues located within 20 miles of this city. Furthermore, the major performing arts markets in Philadelphia and New York create an even more challenging environment for sustaining such venues within such a competitive environment. The message here is that, at least in the short term, the private market is going to determine the need for formal venues, and the city's investments in arts and culture may be more impactful when they are focused on the quality of life of residents and their access to collective assembly and creative activity. And speaking of the city, private and nonprofit sectors, our study revealed that more coordination and collaboration is needed to assure people are aware of the resources, facilities, events, and programs available to them. Each sector has a role to play in organizing activities that are the result of leveraging our significant spatial assets, securing funding, and connecting creators with audiences. But both the public and private have a role to play, with more coordination necessary to navigate the complicated infrastructure that has grown up around cultural activity and public space over the years. So I'm going to take a pause here. I know that was a lot of information. Give anybody who has a question or a comment an opportunity to chime in. Yes, Ms. Jones, please. Those two venues, the Savoy Theater, the Paramount, and the Convention Hall, are currently inactive, and they represent 70% of the total capacity for fixed-seat performance venues in the city.
My name is Felicia Simmons, and also to mention the West Side Community Center.
Yes, the West Side Community Center, while not a formal performance venue, is also currently inactive, yes, and there is a. We'll talk about it a little bit later. A little bit later on, will certainly come up. Once we had a firm understanding of the arts and cultural ecosystem of the city, we continued engaging the community and our steering committee to develop a set of goals and strategies to define a vision for the future and establish how the city and its partners can address gaps in space, funding, community services, policies, and programs related to arts and culture. These goals and strategies were presented at multiple public events, including an open house at Blackbird Community Commons in December, and 5 different focus groups made up of a diverse collection of local creators and community members. That engagement and testing of ideas allowed us to settle on a broadly supported set of 4 goals for the Arts and Culture Plan. Those being augmenting the year-round quality of life, expanding the cultural production ecosystem, fostering inclusion, community cohesion, well-being, and lifelong learning, and supporting tourism, creative enterprises, and the cultural economy. The plan also identifies 4 strategies that create a framework for meeting those goals. Strategy 1 is to provide resources, facilities, and programs for individual creativity, recreation, and lifelong learning. Strategy 2 is to align development, land use, funding, and other policies to support tourism and the homegrown creative economy. Strategy 3 is to leverage the brand of Asbury Park as an inclusive and creative city where diversity thrives. Strategy 4 is to transform streets and public spaces to support next-level art and cultural activity. I'm going to stop here and give anybody an opportunity to ask some questions or it is the hope of this plan that the inventory will be taken and expanded so that, and we'll talk about this in the recommendation, so that people might be able to literally just go to a searchable database and say, I need a community room for 20 people and I have $50 to spend, and they would be able to figure that out. That's a very basic thing that most creative communities would have, which leverages underutilized space in non-public facilities that are community-oriented. Yeah, so yes. Yes and no is the answer. It's on its way. It will not be the output of this plan, but the plan will say, here's the inventory we made, and now the implementers of this plan, the city and its partners, are going to have to figure out how to use that information.
Necessary byproduct.
Yes, absolutely, yes. And so all of this data that we have is essentially tracked both geographically, like we know, literally it's a mapping program, so we know the address, location, and we can add certain attributes to it, like what's the capacity, what's the cost, but that's not exactly the job of this plan, it's the job of a later recommendation. So now this is really what we're here to talk about tonight, all of the biggest recommendations of the plan. There's probably a lot of things here that, if you have a question and didn't see it covered, we can talk about it. I'm kind of doing the greatest hits tonight. But while the goals and strategies set a general framework for the plan, we developed specific recommendations that are meant to be implemented in a phased strategy that unfolds over many years. Before we dive into the specific recommendations, I want to acquaint you with a few concepts that were critical to the evaluation, selection, and development of these recommendations. First, all recommendations were developed using a framework of inclusion. The goal of this plan is to ensure that all members of the community are invited to participate and contribute to its rich and diverse community culture. Second, we worked in a yes-and framework. This is a lesson from improvisational performance where all responses begin with yes and. It's a technique that recognizes the value of every person's perspective and integrates their thoughts and contributions into the outcomes. Finally, nothing you see tonight is all or nothing or now or never. A plan is a roadmap that is meant to unfold over many years. The recommendations may seem big, large, complicated, and expensive. Some of them are. However, each recommendation starts with small, low-cost actions that establish a framework for more complicated, longer-term actions in the future, like a searchable database for available community facilities. Cost $0. Okay. So the first recommendation is probably the driest one, so I wanted to start there. We'll get to the more exciting ones. It's establish a funding stream for community arts, culture, and recreation. A hallmark of creative communities is a stable and consistent funding stream for supporting community arts and culture. How that funding is provided and how it is used is different from place to place. In some places, funding is provided through property taxes, sales taxes, or other municipal revenue sources. In other communities, special purpose taxes such as liquor, hotel occupancy, tourism, or cannabis sales are used to fund priorities including arts, culture, and education. As an example, the city of Hoboken includes what's called a percent for art in every city bond ordinance that is used to fund public infrastructure. The mural you see in this picture was funded by including an additional 1% of the total cost of upgrading an existing parking garage in the city. A small price to pay for a work of art by a renowned artist that allows the garage to be more than a garage. Currently, Asbury Park has no recognizable funding stream that is solely dedicated to community arts, culture, or recreation. In an attempt to keep it just to the facts, with so many competing priorities in the city, it's not that surprising that arts, culture, and recreation have not risen to the top yet. However, the time has come. The collective need of the community to engage and contribute to creative activity and collective gathering should be funded. These critical funds would support the broadly held desire of residents to have an outstanding year-round quality of life and access to arts and cultural activity. It's easy to boil this down to how much is this going to cost me. However, it's not now or never, and it's not all or nothing. So, the initial action involved in establishing a funding stream is simply to identify the funding priorities and levels for a given period of time, let's say 5 years. This costs $0. The next step is to identify and evaluate the sources of that funding, also at a cost of $0. After that, this is where the rubber meets the road, when the budgetary, policy, and legislative mechanisms that secure that funding are enacted. This will take time, negotiation, political will, and accountability. But smaller actions at the beginning will begin to build to a larger action that results in a stable funding source for community arts and culture. The final step is to evaluate effectiveness of the outcomes of that funding. This is a cyclical review that should be done to assure that funding goals and priorities remain aligned. Any questions? Kitty.
My name is Kitty. On the 1% that you touched on, that's a standard program that happens around the country, correct?
Correct. It's 1% is a misnomer. In some places it's 0.25%, some places 4%. Yeah, it's
but in
yeah.
general,
Yes.
known as the 1%.
A percent for art. Yes. Yes, Nancy.
Nancy Sabino, you said step 1 and step 2 would cost nothing. Who would be doing that?
That's a good question. It would. It's really the city infrastructure doing it. So it costs it is the cost of paying our professionals and our city councilors who aren't paid to take up the banner of figuring out where in the public budget that money comes from. There are sources that do remain untapped that could provide some of that funding, like a percent for art. For example, we just bonded $22 million for a firehouse. 0.25% of that cost would have netted $50,000. That's a lot of money for a community that currently has no budget line item for arts and culture. I'm not saying that that was wrong or not, but that's just what we're talking about. The city floats bonds all the time for infrastructure projects, for operations, for paying debt, for whatever it is. Lots of cities say, okay, we need to take a small slice of every one of those and make sure that it's going towards arts, culture, recreation. The plan acknowledges the need to create a funding stream. The plan cannot, from this perspective, solve or answer how it's done. What it does is provides that roadmap for starting the conversation, the process, and then getting to that point where you enact what's necessary to make it happen. That's another great point about the UEZ, Urban Enterprise Zone money. Yeah, it's out there. There are grants.
As an artist from Asbury, born and raised, we talk a lot about this kind of stuff, but I don't really see people like me around these type of things, and I don't know if it's necessarily because they don't want to be or because they just don't know. Yeah.
So I will after we run through all of the recommendations, I'm going to sort of address inclusion, how inclusion runs through each recommendation in a holistic fashion. But through the process of developing these recommendations, we could not have gotten to them without adopting a framework of inclusion, which required us to go out into the community, to be present at community events all over town, in the West Side, in the East Side, in communities, in the park. Those were the public events we attended. We also, while we were doing that, we also gathered people's contact information and emails. And when we were doing focus groups, we reached out specifically to those folks to make sure that they knew we have an opportunity for input. A lot of people took us up on that opportunity. We had a very diverse group of people who are self-identified as creators who contributed. Now, to that end, Asbury Park is just barely still a majority-minority city. And the historical divisions that exist are perpetuated by a perception that what is the most important are the endpoint events that happen in one sector of this town. This plan flatly rejects that as the priority and says what's more important is who's making art and culture here and how we make that available to every member of our community, starting from the youngest to the oldest. And so I think as we start to run through some more of these, you'll see that inclusion is a theme, that this isn't about making sure we have more concerts at the Stone Pony. It's about making sure that the local hip hop artist who's working on the West Side knows that there is a recording facility that they might be able to access here in town through a network that allows them to find those things. Because it's not knowing about something and not knowing somebody is doing something are two sides of the same problem. You know, it's that. And then there is an issue of how programming is managed holistically throughout the city. There are so many concerts and events. So few of those are represented in Afro, Latin, Caribbean, Spanish, Hispanic music. And that is 50% of our community. How does that change? That is what this plan is saying should change. That every opportunity should be taken to make sure that the culture that is represented here is broadly representative of the actual year-round community. You know, you're correct. The demographics of this room do not truly represent the demographics of our city. As you will see, the plan tries to make sure that we have represented the broad spectrum of people we have engaged in the creation of this plan. It is as much about amplifying underrepresented communities as it is simply advertising for those who aren't. And, you know, like the hard work of doing that, this plan can identify and does identify that more work needs to be done to amplify Black, Indigenous, people of color, Hispanic, Latino communities and their contributions to the city's cultural landscape. Yeah.
Can I just say archive?
Yeah,
That was pretty much the word I was looking at. I couldn't pull out.
Yeah.
Archive.
Right, and you know, a personal note is when my firm undertook this work, we assumed that the city had a workable database of information of community organizations, events, nothing. Nothing existed because the person who maintained that information no longer worked for the city, and they just didn't know where it was. So there is a two-sided equation here. It's like, yes, it would have been great to start from something. We started from zero. So the second recommendation is to expand city resources for public programs, community facilities, and cultural affairs. During our investigation, research, and community outreach, we quickly identified that the public approvals and coordination process for both public programs and private events are currently handled by a limited number of staff within City Hall. The city staff member who produces a community event in the park that includes face painting, and bouncy houses, and whatever else it is the same person who's responsible for coordinating See Here Now. With more than 80,000 participants over 3 days and a month-long logistics setup and breakdown. The economic value of that can't be understated, but it may ultimately reduce the capacity of the government to address communal needs of the year-round residents. The Arts and Culture Plan recommends that we separate the interfaces, processes, and resources that should be allocated to public programs and private events. These specialized roles would be focused on coordinating public programs and community facilities that are community-facing on one side, and a second set of resources would be available for cultural affairs and special events that are more closely related to commercial activity, tourism, and economic development. In addition to providing specialized management of public and private programming, there is a need for the active management and programming of our community facilities, including parks and open spaces. The story here is similar. The heroic Department of Public Works is responsible for everything from potholes to stormwater infrastructure to beaches and public parks and street signs and street lights. In the short term, it's possible to create a division within the Department of Public Works that is responsible for maintaining parks, open spaces, and community facilities. To start, this division would interface with the Public Programs and Community Facilities Coordinator I discussed just a minute ago. Over the long term, it probably makes sense to merge these functions into a formal Department of Parks and Recreation that is responsible for maintenance, operation, planning, and programming of all public spaces, community facilities, and parks throughout the city. This is very common in many cities, in Monmouth County, in the state, and in the country. Typically, departments of public works focus on infrastructure maintenance. A Department of Parks and Recreation is focused on public programs and public facilities, and a separate entity is responsible for cultural affairs that are coordinating privately produced events in public spaces. Again, this doesn't happen all at once. There are near-term actions, such as maximizing the use of existing spaces in schools, churches, and communities. This may start with developing a searchable database for people to find venues and locations to host their community-based events, including public programs produced by the cities. This has a cost of $0. Next, we differentiate the resources for public programs and private events to provide clear mechanisms for supportive community activity and the private cultural activity that drives our city's economy. Over time, departments can be restructured to provide a specific focus on how public spaces and facilities are managed, maintained, and programmed, culminating in a Department of Parks and Recreation that provides a comprehensive management framework specifically focused on inclusive community arts, culture, and recreation. Any questions? Yes, okay, so when you talk about diversifying the Arts Council, I'm curious what it has to do with the city providing the resources to manage community and cultural programs for all residents. The Arts Council is a 501c3 organization that formed on its own and chartered itself on its own without the involvement of the city government. As I stated at the beginning of this presentation, the Arts Council secured the funding as a 501c3 organization through the COVID-19 Community Recovery Grant to produce this plan. They approached the city and said, we've secured funding to do an arts and culture plan, which the city master plan recommends. The city agreed that the Arts Council, under the direction of the city, would produce that plan. Yes, the city needs to do more to actually coordinate artistic and cultural activity for residents.
Written in paper.
This, what I've just presented, expanding city resources for public programs, community facilities, and cultural affairs, is that. It's not typical that cities have their own arts councils. It is very typical that cities have departments of cultural affairs and departments of parks and recreation that coordinate their activities to make sure that community cultural and community facility activities are done in conjunction with some sort of broader vision for arts and culture in the community. So yes, this is sort of addressing that, maybe in slightly different words. The next recommendation is for the city to engage a cultural resources partner. Over the course of this planning effort, we've met many creators and members of our community who identify as creators. This is Tayasia Newman, a writer, editor, and fashion designer who lives here in the city, Connie Freestone, a photographer who couldn't be with us tonight but wanted to, and Anthony D'Amato, a nationally recognized recording artist and actor. Some people know him as Remember Jones. Each of these people is at a different stage of development in terms of how their creative pursuits are becoming their livelihoods. However, each of them expressed the same conundrum. Despite high levels of creative activity in town, it's hard to know what other creators are doing, difficult to find production or rehearsal spaces, and there are limited resources for creators to connect to funding, audiences, and collaborators, especially if they are coming from underrepresented and disadvantaged backgrounds. Other cities that experience this type of problem have developed what are called creative resource partnerships. Typically, this is a nonprofit organization or partner that coordinates the facility and facilitates cultural activity on behalf of the city. I feel like these are a lot of the words that were just used here. This may include networking, grant-making assistance, creative enterprise incubation, and coordination of resources. They act as intermediaries between the public, the creative community, and the city. In some cases, the organizations may also interface with specific components of the government, including the Public Art Commission or a Department of Parks and Recreation that is responsible for public programs. Regardless of who the organization is, the presence of a viable partner to provide these services to the public is deeply needed by the members of the creative community throughout the city. The process begins with the city defining the types of resources and services that are needed. I mentioned some of them. Next, the city defines their relationships and responsibilities they are looking for in their partner organization. Next, they determine how funding is provided to secure those services. And finally, they formally establish the partnership through a request for proposals and a formal selection process. This result is a community hub for cultural resources and information. Not often within the kind of normal competencies of a city to really coordinate art and cultural activity, you know? And so, but there are nonprofits all over the country that do exactly that for their communities. We have one that does it at the county level. It's called Monmouth Arts. And they sort of look at the broader county. Many municipalities have an ancillary 501c3 that the city provides funding to that does that work. So the city and that entity come to an agreement about what the funding level is and what they expect to get for that money. And so there is that relationship that can be created. It doesn't exist right now. This is saying that the city needs to establish what that looks like and figure out what the responsibilities of that other entity are. Obviously, this evening, one big concern is how that entity would be broadly inclusive and how part of their remit would be amplifying the voices of underrepresented communities, particularly in artistic and creative pursuits. A creative arts partnership is not solely funded by the city. The city generally provides a portion of that funding, and that creative arts partnership does all of the fundraising, granting, and that it can do to fund the rest of its operations. Asbury Park is a city of 15,000 full-time residents. That is not representative of the actual number of people who live here. The population density of Asbury Park is much more commensurate with a city like Hoboken or Jersey City. We're actually on par with that for population density. And those cities spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on their creative arts partnerships. That is funded through some of those things that we talked about earlier. A % for art, whatever that public funding stream for the arts that is established could very well be used for this type of thing. You know, so all of these recommendations are a little bit interrelated. Like, we need to have funding that is for arts and community culture and recreation. We need a cultural resources partner. And within the city government, there needs to be specific resources who are meant to manage community programs and private commercial cultural activity. It's a comprehensive approach, sort of like three-legged stool here. Yeah, I mentioned that earlier, that typically there are three components, which would be the Department of Public Works maintaining infrastructure, the Department of Parks and Recreation maintaining community facilities and community programs, and then the Department of Cultural Affairs, which is more interfacing with kind of the economic development side of cultural activity. There are lots of creative businesses in town, and these are small business owners, just like any other person. And so the capacity they have for doing, extensive fundraising or funding of third-party sources may be quite limited, even if you perceive that business to be highly successful. However, there's a lot of drinks that are sold in town at 5 cents a vodka and tonic. We'd be rolling in Van Goghs and Degas. So there are ways that businesses could be tapped for those things. The next recommendation, we're going to start moving more into physical things now. The next recommendation is to center the city's visual brand on creativity and community values. Asbury Park is a city with a rich cultural history, a diverse population, and a tourism-based economy. However, the physical infrastructure that supports both community and commercial activity does little to send a message that Asbury Park is a city where creativity, diversity, and inclusion thrive. Public infrastructure, including bike racks, benches, signage, lights, bathrooms, and other elements of the urban environment, are all opportunities to express community values in ways that build civic pride for residents and supplement the experience of visitors and the tourist economy. Over the years, the public and private efforts have applied a very temporary and tactical solution to this problem throughout the city. However, with the nascent and growing brand around public art and creativity, it's time for Asbury to graduate from a tactical framework to a framework that prioritizes permanent transformation of streets, public spaces, and urban infrastructure. This type of approach can be seen in many places, and when applied correctly, speaks for itself. Over many years, the city of Miami Beach has been mining its connection to Art Deco design and architecture to advance historic preservation, tourism, and community branding. These images make it hard to argue the effectiveness of the method in creating a visual brand that is as interesting as it is beautiful. The Art and Culture Plan recommends that the city and its partners undertake a process to look at the many ways a consistent visual brand can be deployed throughout the city. The plan further recommends that the brand should be the result of a process that establishes motifs, patterns, and styles that are derived from shared community history, culture, and values. This is not simply an issue of creating one element and applying it throughout the city. This is a process that uses tools like typography, colors, logos, and other elements of a brand, and applies them to urban infrastructure in the same way that you would apply it to things like social media, tourism marketing, and merchandise, that together define an identity that is recognizable to visitors and authentic to the experience of living in Asbury Park. Again, at first, this does not have to be an expensive or complicated endeavor. The first step would be to engage an expert resource and the community in creating a system of tools and assets that define the elements of the city's visual brand. Then the city can look at the cycle of infrastructural renewal and develop a plan for integrating the visual identity into every project the city undertakes. How are colors used? How are logos applied? What places and neighborhoods have special identities that must be amplified and celebrated? Over time, the cycle of renewal builds the visual brand, project by project, element by element. Finally, the city may engage in a tourism and marketing campaign that turns our visual brand outward as a tool for economic development and promotion of our rich profile of cultural and artistic opportunities for visitors year-round and citywide. The next recommendation is to support and connect cultural nodes and community gateways. In researching cultural activity within the city, it was apparent that there are currently 3 recognizable cultural districts. The Waterfront District, generally focused on tourism and entertainment. The Downtown District, generally focused on arts and commerce. And the Springwood District, generally focused on community culture and activities. The plan makes general recommendations for each of these areas, including the establishment of community focal points, expanding placemaking and programming, and incentivizing specific uses that augment the different functions of each district. The Springwood Community Cultural District has many educational, open space, community facilities, and community organizations centered around the intersection of Atkins and Springwood Avenues. Signature streetscaping and urban design in this area could augment the emerging community focal point and establish an important community gateway, cultural gateway, on the west side of town. The city should also continue to incentivize the development of housing, particularly affordable housing, to assure that housing supply is keeping pace with demand, especially as it relates to retaining existing residents. Within the downtown district, the traditional commercial environment can be augmented by establishing clear focal points that allow an increased level of public programs and events. The art and culture plan suggests that there are significant opportunities to create streetscapes on Main Street, marking the entrance to the core of the commercial area of the city. Deeper into the district, Press Plaza could be transformed into a public space that is capable of hosting events and community gatherings. This would include an upgrade of the streetscape design that allows the street to be temporarily closed to traffic and used for events such as concerts, markets, and events. It's important to mention that these public programs and events should engage all members of the Asbury Park community. This means procuring and producing events and partnerships that showcase local talent, homegrown enterprises, and are broadly representative of the ethnic and racial groups that make up our year-round population. The city should also continue to work with existing landowners on redevelopment projects that augment the profile of cultural uses and venues within the downtown district. This may include revisions to zoning, redevelopment plans, and incentives offered for the inclusion of community and cultural uses. Within the Waterfront Entertainment and Tourism District, existing spaces along the Boardwalk and Ocean Avenue could be significantly improved to support placemaking and programming. In rethinking focal points on 4th Avenue and Asbury Avenue, the city has an opportunity to provide a greater level of free programming that appeals to residents and visitors alike. As these spaces are transformed to support greater levels of artistic and cultural activity, it's again important to remember that programming of these spaces should seek to amplify the contributions of local creators to the collective community identity, be it busking, performance, public art, or general community activity. In other words, the waterfront, the city's greatest economic and open space asset, should feel authentic and inclusive to the entire Asbury Park community. In addition to thinking about the 3 cultural districts, there was also a recommendation in this 2017 City Master Plan that suggested the creation of a new arts district along Asbury Avenue, shown in red here. Given what we learned in this study, the Art and Culture Plan will not recommend this approach. With 3 functioning art and culture districts in the city, the establishment of another may dilute the impact or the focus of existing cultural nodes. What this plan does recommend for this area is the establishment of a signature community gateway as the primary vehicular linkage for visitors arriving from the broader highway system. This area can be improved to establish a signature entryway into the commercial, culture, and community context of our city. In addition to streetscaping, public art, and other creative expressions in public space along this corridor, the surrounding area can be an important reservoir for housing that is crucial for retaining existing residents and live-work housing that combines living and production facilities for small-scale creators working within the community. Beyond the different ways of supporting the existing cultural districts in the city, it's important that each of the districts feel they are part of a comprehensive whole, rather than isolated and independent from each other. So the plan recommends the establishment of the West Side to Waterfront Art and Cultural Heritage Trail. This idea was also suggested in a different form in the Asbury Park Plan for Walking and Biking, another component of the city's master plan. The work of the Art and Culture Plan suggests a continuous trail that is connected using public art, sculpture, programmatic activations, and community focal points as a final piece in creating a comprehensive network of connected arts and cultural districts throughout the city, which recognizes the individual and contributory aspects of each district. I am certain that this seems like a lot. But again, it's a long process that begins with simple actions like updating zoning and redevelopment plans, a relatively low-cost effort. This is followed by planning and design studies that create the parameters for reimagining how streets and public spaces can better serve the community's collective programmatic needs. This is augmented with specific programming and placemaking plan that is inclusive of local creators and the many diverse communities that make up our city. After all that, the city finally allocates the funding for design and construction projects, resulting in an integrated system of nodes and community gateways throughout the city that are developed over time. You know, we've been talking a lot about sort of policy and sort of theoretical recommendations, and I'm sure a lot of you are asking, like, well, okay, this is an arts and culture plan. What does that look like? Well, we've produced some renderings to give you a flavor of what these types of interventions could look like. Before I move to that, I want to be clear that these are intended to articulate a vision and are not final design proposals. Each intervention we have described so far requires significant additional planning, engagement, and design in order to be realized. And specific outreach should be done to communities they affect. But since this is an art and culture plan, it's important to use a little bit of imagination and to dream about possibilities. So what could that look like? This is what people currently see when they arrive at the intersection of Comstock and Asbury Avenue. There is a redevelopment proposal. I encourage everybody to show up at the planning board next week when they entertain the development that will go on that site off to the right. And this is what it could look like if a creative streetscape were implemented along Asbury Avenue. It would transform the space into a gateway that inspires civic pride, establishes a brand of creativity for visitors arriving from other places. In conjunction with new housing and more permissive uses related to cultural and artistic production, one can imagine an active gateway that firmly establishes the brand of Asbury Park as creative, welcoming, and cosmopolitan. Next, we have Press Plaza and the West Side to Waterfront Art and Cultural Heritage Trail. As a primary pedestrian entrance into the city from Ocean Grove and a midpoint within the downtown district, the potential for this space to contribute to public perception of downtown as an active, engaging, and creative place is endless. In fact, it could look like this. Signature streetscape and plaza design would allow the street to be temporarily closed into usable space for community and commercial activities such as concerts, markets, and festivals. The West Side to Waterfront Cultural Trail along Lake Avenue can integrate sculpture, public art, branding, and public space design to support connectivity between districts that is punctuated with active spaces for community activities and cultural programs such as music, performance, and busking. Up next, this is the current picture of the intersection of 4th Avenue and Ocean Avenue, with the Ocean Club building in the background. Using a similar framework for providing infrastructure for community gateways and placemaking activities, this is what it could look like. Signature intersection design, expanded public art and sculpture, and augmented seating to support busking, performance, and gathering could transform this space from a parking lot into a vibrant community gathering space. It's important to note that this transformative design, as imagined, comes at the expense of 2 parking spaces, which I will posit is a completely reasonable cost for likely improvement in public space design and placemaking opportunities. Now, for our big recommendation to develop a community culture center. Of all the work that has been done during this study, no gap has been more acute than the need for the development of a high-quality facilities to support community arts, culture, and recreation. While Asbury Park has a significant portfolio of educational and community spaces, there are precious few resources that are broadly accessible to the public or flexible enough to support the range of community events, gatherings, and activities that are hallmarks of creative communities. To that end, what this plan envisions is the creation of a community culture center that contains an adequate profile of spaces for a variety of creative, artistic, recreational, and educational pursuits. This study cannot be definitive about the components of a community culture center, but it is likely that some of the necessary components would include rehearsal space, meeting space, performance space, maker and production space, informational resources, galleries and exhibitions, and other things the community needs and desires. Ultimately, more study is needed to determine the exact composition of a community culture center, but that need for such a space within the community could not be clearer. Again, it's a long process. That begins with a feasibility and conceptual design study that answers many of the questions I just alluded to. This is followed by a business and operations plan, the development of funding strategies and partnerships, and the culmination in the actual design and construction of the facility. This is another example of low-cost actions building to more significant ones over time. Many of you may ask, but where is it? It's a good question. Well, to be honest, the plan will not answer that question. However, it can offer some responses to where it could be. A reconstituted West Side Community Center. With the right agreements or coordination, it could be inside, resurrected. It could be inside an existing Board of Education facility. We have lots of underutilized school space. It could be part of a plan to redevelop City Hall. A nonprofit developer in town could agree to include it in a development. Yes, it could be any of these or others. The next question you ask is, well, what would it look like? Well, we've prepared a conceptual rendering of what the interior space of something like this could look like. Just a reminder, this is meant to evoke a vision, not be definitive about individual components or a design vocabulary. With facilities for playing, learning, making, moving, doing, producing, a contemporary community facility combines elements of places like libraries, schools, and sports facilities to create a flexible space that supports collective activities, individual creativity, and community events within the same space. In fact, many spaces could do double duty, allowing them to be reconfigured depending on the uses and programs at a given moment. This rendering imagines a central space that can be equal parts community commons and performance space. Movement on this recommendation would provide the community a true center of gravity that engenders inclusive community activities and supports the community vision to be a creative, year-round community with an outstanding quality of life for residents. When we look across the big recommendations that this is what we have, I'll give you a minute to sort of look across them, and I'll take a minute to remind you that each of these strategies, whether physical, organizational, or policy, is aimed at providing an inclusive environment that provides community arts and culture at the same time that it supports vibrant cultural economy. So what about the other stuff? What other stuff? Well, many things cropped up in the study that were related to arts and culture. However, this plan cannot answer every question. It cannot address every recommendation of the city master plan. So while there are important contributions to the arts and culture, while they are important contributors to arts and culture, there are other planning and urban design initiatives the city should undertake in order to fully support all aspects of the city's shared cultural identity. Having already completed a plan for walking and biking, the art and culture plan provides the next level of detail around a specific element. However, additional planning should be done to define parameters of things like historic preservation, open space and recreation, sustainability, resiliency, and green building standards, all expressions of shared values that have interactions with arts and culture. What's next? Well, after this evening, we will begin coordinating with the planning board to begin the official approval and adoption process of the Arts and Culture Plan. We anticipate that those meetings will happen in May and June. Please come. These are additional opportunities for input with the planning board into the final adoption of the plan. If you want to stay apprised of future developments, please make sure to see Carrie Turner, who's at the contact sheet and can provide you, you can provide her email address to get notified. And with that, I do want to thank everybody for your time and attention and your input this evening. And I hope you have a really good night. Thank you. Thank you.